Welcome to the Information Systems project. This is topic 6 and this is the final topic of the lecture series for the project, and we're going to deal this week with your proposals, your project proposals, your reports and the write-ups that you have to do as part of the project. Just a quick recap of what we've covered over the last 5 lectures. First of all, during topic 1 we looked at how to select a project, and from our discussions I believe you've all selected a suitable project. Then we looked at analysing projects, making sure that the projects that you've selected are achievable, and we used SWOT analysis to do that. Then topic 3 dealt with looking at systems development methodologies. The reason for this was to ensure that you choose an appropriate methodology for your project. You should, as part of your research, analyse different methodologies and explain then why you've chosen the methodology that you have. Topic 4, we looked at use case driven development. No matter which development methodology you're applying, use case driven development is still appropriate, and it's a very good way of analysing the requirements of your project and deciding on the scope of your project. So make sure that you have an initial use case diagram, and you can use use case driven development to analyse your project in more depth once you've chosen which particular tasks you're going to complete. Then topic 5 dealt with project planning. So we take the tasks that are included in the use case driven development, we take research tasks, we take all the reports that you've got to produce as part of your project, and we count those all as part of the work to be done to complete the project. And we've dealt there with creating a work breakdown structure so that you can analyse those tasks in more detail to get a full understanding of what it is that you need to do in order to finish this project. So this final topic we're going to look at a number of things. We're going to look at finalising the project proposal. This is due in at the end of this week, so you'll need to listen carefully to what is being said here and make sure that you implement what has been said. We're going to then look briefly at the interim report. This is something that you've already been asking questions about, and we'll deal with the structure of that report and the submission of that report later on in this topic. And then finally we'll look at the final report, what has to be in that report and its purpose. So by the end of this topic you'll certainly be able to complete your project proposal, and you will have to complete your project proposal. You'll also understand the requirements for the interim report and the requirements for the final report, so you'll need to refer back to this lecture when you get closer to completing those 2 reports, because they are a while off at the moment, although that time will soon go and it will come around very quickly. Okay, so this first part is really looking at the project proposal, the imminent report that you have to submit. This is worth marks for you, and the reason we give you marks for such proposals is to ensure that you as a student concentrate on getting it right. It's a very valuable part of the project. Even if there were no marks for it, it would still be a necessary and valuable part. If we were doing a project for industry, then this proposal would form part of the contract between the developers and the client. Okay, it specifies exactly what is being done and therefore what is being paid for. So it specifies what you intend to do for the project, why it is being done. In industry, perhaps the why it is being done might not be included, but certainly for an academic project like the one that you're doing, we need to know clearly why you're doing this project, what is the purpose of your project, and we have discussed that in previous lectures. The proposal will also specify when certain things are going to be complete, and these completion dates are very, very important when you've got a real project that's intended to make somebody some money or intended to solve a particular problem. Clients have their own deadlines, their business has deadlines, and those deadlines will be determined by when you deliver your software. So if there's a delay in any of the tasks, and quite often this can cause serious disruption to the client's business. So it becomes very important that those deadlines are put into the proposal and they do form part of the contract. For your project, you don't have a client, but you do have some important deadlines, and the least of those deadlines are the submission of certain reports, such as the project proposal, the interim report and the final report. Those deadlines are immovable. You will not be able to change them, and so they form a very large part of the structure of your project. So your proposal needs to include those in there. I would also suggest that you think about, when you're dealing with your project plans and you're thinking about timing, then that you think about the other things that you've got to do on your course, for example. So you've got other units which will have assignments in, so build that time into your thinking when you're planning how long it's going to take you to do bits of the project. Okay, you're not going to just be able to concentrate solely on the project, you will do your other units as well, so build the time in that you've got to spend on those. Finally, the project proposal will usually contain a full breakdown of the resources and the costs. Okay, costs are relevant to a industrial project, not really relevant to your project. It might be costing you money to produce this project, but you're not going to have to lay out a bill of materials or a set of costs of resources in order to do this, so they're not really relevant, so I wouldn't worry about building those in. They would be part of a real project, but they're not part of an academic project, so please leave them out. Right, some of the work you've done for me so far over the last few weeks, or should have done, are looking at your project title and a brief summary of your project. You've all, as far as I've seen, produced these things, and those that I've given feedback to, those that I've seen, I'm fairly satisfied that you are currently working along the right lines for this project. There's a brief description of the requirements, and that should take the form of a use case diagram. I've not seen many of the use case diagrams so far, but that will give me a brief indication of what the possible functionalities are in your project, and it gives me an idea of what you've decided is achievable in the time. So I will give you some feedback on those as soon as I see them, just to let you know what I think of the amount of work that you think you can achieve. There should be a list of tasks that need to be completed, and that list should be generated by looking at the project and creating a work breakdown structure. And of course, from that work breakdown structure you should have created an activity network that shows the relationship between those tasks. It would be quite nice if you could do a forward pass through that and then a backward pass, and basically do critical path analysis in order to show what the expected completion of your project. But I wouldn't expect you to keep those documents up to date. However, the important document that you do have would be the Gantt chart, and that will be needed to be kept up to date throughout the project, reflecting the reality of what you're doing, what you said you're doing, and how well you're getting on with it. So all of those things that we've just talked about you've already done, and they all form part of your project proposal, so largely you've produced a rather large amount of work already that fits into that proposal. Now your task really is to format that to make it make sense and make it readable and make it understandable to somebody perhaps who has not really paid much attention to your projects. That isn't me. So additional things you will need, a list of resources that you require for the project. Okay, this would lead to a list of costs perhaps if we were doing an industrial project, but certainly you need to be clear in your head what it is that you're going to need, and this again may influence your selection of project. If you find there are resources that you need that aren't available, then you're going to have to rethink what you're going to do or how you're going to do it. So thinking about resources now is a good idea, because it helps you ensure that you are able to complete this project. You should have a list of references used from the initial planning. You've done some reading on project management, certainly, and you will have done some reading around and searching around the internet to find out more about the subject of your project. So make sure that you reference all that material and have a reference list at the end of your project proposal. Also remember that this is a formal report, okay, so you need to write formally, and it should really be in what we call the passive voice. So you're not writing I did this and I did that. You're writing this was done and that was done. Okay, that's a brief example of what the passive voice is. I can live with you using occasional I's and we's and so on if you can't help yourself and if you find it too difficult to write in the passive voice, but really it should be written in the passive voice, as that actually gives more authority to your work, and it's good experience for you, good practice to earn with your written English. You should assume that the reader of your project and your proposal in particular at the moment knows a little bit about IT and your subject, but they don't really know anything about your project other than what you are going to write in that proposal. So make it clear. Don't assume that anybody knows anything about what you're going to do. Spell it out, okay? It needs to be obvious from the start. The first paragraph of your proposal needs to make it clear what it is that you are trying to achieve with this project. And remember, we've talked about the achievement. It's not about what you're building, it's about what you're going to do with the thing you build, what you're going to learn from having built it. So, as I said, assume that the reader knows a little bit about IT and a bit about your subject, but don't assume they know anything about your project. Okay, the document that you're writing as a proposal is the thing that tells them what it is you're doing and explains to them. So bear that in mind when you're writing it. We've been talking about this document for a little while now, so when we talk about it, yes, we know what's going to be in it, but you have to write it as if the person reading doesn't know what's in it. Okay, so the structure of the proposal should look something like this. First of all, obviously there's a title. This is still largely a working title. Okay, it's pretty close to the final title by now, but it was still consider it a working title. My view on the project is that you don't really know what you've done until you've done it, and so the title should be something that's flexible, and we can review the title at the end to make sure it does match what you have actually done with the detail of the project. So we have a title, and then we'll have a bit of project background. Okay, I want to know the area that the project's in and some background to the reasons you're thinking around why it's important to do that. Okay, so a little bit of background, and then the project aim. The aim is a long-term, quite high-level description of what you want to achieve from the project. Okay, and there really should only be one aim. I don't want a list of aims. There should be one main aim for this project. What is it you're really trying to achieve? Okay, so it's an expansion of the title, and just one simple paragraph. The relationship between the background and the project aim is quite a close one. The background of the project should say, give information about the area that you're going to work in, the problems that are in that area, and you should almost be able to say at the end of that background you should probably have a sentence that says, therefore the aim of the project is, okay, and then explain the aim. So think about that when you're writing the background section. The project aim is broken down into a number of objectives. Okay, this is where the detail of what you're going to do starts to be written. So you've got a general aim that's related to the title and the background, and that aim is then broken down. What is it that you need to do in order to fulfill that aim? And that produces a list of objectives. Again, you shouldn't have too many objectives. 4 or 5 is probably adequate. And you should explain what the objective is as a bullet point, and then explain underneath that bullet point how it is you think you're going to achieve it. Okay, you're not setting anything in stone here. This is how you think you're going to achieve those objectives. If that changes during the project because you find out more, well, that's actually the purpose of the project. So let's not worry about whether we're going to change or not, and whether we know everything about our project yet. These are objectives that you expect you're going to have to do at this point in time. The next section, justification and technical challenges. Okay, so why are you doing the project? What's the purpose of it? What is the academic aim of this project? And what do you think is going to be the thing that, or the things that make it a level 6 project? Okay, so technical challenges, things you're going to learn, things that you're going to have to overcome. The next section, the scope of the project. This is really where you now start to say, well, this is what I'm trying to achieve, and I'm just going to achieve that by building System A. And then System A, it could be actually quite large, and having seen some of your project proposals, System A will be quite large, but that is where you have to limit the scope of the project. You cannot achieve everything that you want to build in the time that you've got, so you're going to have to limit it and decide what it is that actually does fulfill your aim and objectives out of that system that you're investigating. So this scope of the project is related to your use case diagram. Okay, it's an initial use case diagram, and you've prioritised those use cases and identified which ones you believe you're going to be developing. Again, this isn't set in stone. Your prioritisation will say, I will do maybe 5 or 6 of these use cases, and if you find you've got time later on in the project, then you can do some more if you need to. Okay, if you find that you haven't got enough time, and this is usually the case, then you can reduce the number of use cases, but you have to bear in mind the objectives that you set. And if you set objectives that are realistic at the start and then find you're not going to achieve them, then we have to find a way of reducing the workload. So having a good full set of use cases and being able to adjust this prioritisation on them is a good way of doing that. Then we need a list of deliverables. What are you going to actually produce? Well, you're going to produce a lot of documentation, and all that should be listed in your deliverables. You're going to produce an application, which will be an information system, so it will be a database with some sort of front end, whether that's a web front end or whether it's Visual Basic or whatever the front end might be. That's going to be the deliverables, and I would divide the database and the front end of the database into 2 separate deliverables. You'll also have a number of project planning documents, and they need to be in there, and of course you'll have your proposal, your interim report and your final report as deliverables. Don't forget those, they are part of the project. We then have a schedule, and the schedule is essentially your project plan, and the Gantt chart goes in here, but you'll need to make sure that your Gantt chart shows which tasks are happening when, but you'll need a separate task list that explains in more detail what those tasks are. The next section I've got here is references. You might want a final section that kind of summarises what you've said in the proposal and refers back to some of the earlier things, just to tidy the document up. It's not totally necessary, but it does make the document a little bit more readable. And so after that you'll need to insert your references. Any research that you've done in order to achieve this project proposal needs to go in there. And finally, you might want to add some additional information. For example, you might want to put your SWOT analysis into your project proposal, since that's what you've used to help you decide on the project. So, but the appendix is the place to put it, and any other sort of more reference information that you might need. Appendices are good for storing extra information, and we generally don't count appendices as part of the word count. If you've got large chunks of information that you reference, you do need to reference, but you only reference it a little throughout the project, then it's better to put it in the appendix and fill your project report with all those details. So, and again, in the final report you will put you'll have descriptions for each, specifications for each of your use cases. I don't expect them to appear in the middle of the report. You can put those in as an appendix. Some of the diagrams, maybe you'll have a large entity relationship diagram that describes your database. Again, I would suggest that goes in the appendix as a whole, and then little snippets of that diagram get put into the report body in order to, when you're referencing them directly. Okay, so use appendices carefully. Use them to store information that interrupts the flow of the document that you're writing. Okay, so there is a document that I'm putting up online that details these sections, gives you just a little bit more about what is in them and what I've said about them. There also will be some stuff about hand-in dates and so on for proposals. Okay, so once you've finished the proposal, what do you do? Well, you can sit back, put your feet up, have a nice cup of tea, and start thinking about all the wonderful stuff that you might like to do instead of carrying on with your project. Or actually, you can pull your shirt sleeves up and get on with the project. I would probably recommend doing the latter. So what you're going to do actually is continue with some of the work that you've started now. You're going to carry on doing the research. Okay, so you're going to need to find out more about the project that you're doing. Okay, this is where you really start to find out what it is you've committed yourself to. When you're doing your research, you're going to need to record your resources. Okay, you've got a number of references that you're going to use, and you should make sure you use a variety of references. Make sure you refer to the internet, of course, because that's handy, but look at books, look at journals. It's always good to have one or two academic journal papers in your project. They're quite advanced, but they do show that you've been looking at some advanced material, so if you can get some journal papers in there, that would be brilliant. Keep your objectives in mind when you're doing your research. That helps you focus your research on important things and not get sidetracked. Okay, so you might decide you want date pickers to appear on your screen. Now if you decide that, then you might spend 3 weeks trying to program a date picker, which has possibly nothing to do with the rest of your project. So when you're doing your research and when you're doing your implementation, remember what it is that you're trying to achieve with the project, and make sure you focus on that in all aspects. This is why I said that in your project log, you should always, when you're doing an activity, list the objective that you're working towards as part of that activity. You need to try and stick to your target dates in your project plan. Okay, if you feel a deadline is approaching, and you're concerned that you're behind, then you do need to spend some late nights and do some hard work in order to achieve that date. If, despite having made all that effort to achieve that target date, you don't succeed in achieving it, it's not the end of the world. Okay, and you shouldn't give up. These things always happen. You will always miss deadlines and dates that you've set, and the reason for that is not because you've failed, it's actually because you've never done this project before or anything like it, and therefore you don't actually know how long these things are going to take. So when you were writing your project plan, you were kind of guessing. Maybe it was an educated guess, but it was a guess. So you shouldn't feel too disheartened if you miss your target dates. You should try and stick to them because they are quite important, and certain dates, like submitting reports, are, as I've said, unmovable. But don't get too disheartened if you miss your own targets, but even so, still try and achieve them. When you do miss target dates, you should also write down why it is you've missed it and what you've learned from the experience. Okay, all the things that go wrong on a project are a very valuable experience, so you should write down what it is that's gone wrong and how you would solve it next time. And those things will end up in your final report. You should also communicate with your supervisor every week. Okay, now that would normally be done via online chat or discussion, okay, or maybe by email. It's entirely up to you how you communicate with your supervisor, but you must have some weekly contact with them. Okay, even if it's just to say, I've not done any email, I've not done any work this week, so we don't have anything to talk about. It's still an important bit of communication. Now your supervisor may think that you do have something to talk about, and they will get back to you and say, well, actually we still need to talk. So please make sure that you are in communication with your supervisor every week of the project, so they can give you advice and you can make sure that you're meeting your targets. Okay, so speaking of supervisors, you should have weekly meetings with them, and when meeting your supervisor, there's a number of things you need to do. First of all, you need to make sure your supervisor is aware of any changes that you've made to the project plan. Okay, you're the one who's running the project, you're the one who's designed the project, you're the one who's doing the work. So if there are changes that you need to make, you're the one who knows about it. So make sure that when you do make those decisions about changing the plan, and these really are changes to the plan, not changes to the project, make sure your supervisor is made aware of them. One way of doing this is actually supplying a new version of the Gantt chart every week. Now I would suggest that you do this. If the project plan hasn't changed, your progress through that plan still will have changed. So every week produce a new version of the Gantt chart. I've recommended using Microsoft Excel or a similar spreadsheet program to create your Gantt chart rather than Microsoft Project, just because it's easier to maintain on a small project. So keep a new version of your Gantt chart for every single week of the project. Okay, you should try and meet with your supervisor every week, but you must update the project plan every week. So if for some reason you don't meet with your supervisor and aren't able to inform them of changes directly, that doesn't mean you shouldn't change them. Okay, so make sure there is an updated plan every single week. You should keep a record of any changes to that plan, and certainly keep a record of why those changes were made, because that is valuable information for your report and your write-up at the end. When you do have a meeting with your supervisor, you're fortunate in that most of your meetings will be online in some format. So it might be chat, might be discussion, might be email. But you need to keep a record of what was said during the meeting. Okay, and really you need to confirm that record with your supervisor. If we were meeting face-to-face or having a telephone conversation or a Skype conversation, then you need to record that conversation, and then I would write a summary of that conversation to make sure that you know what has been said and what has been agreed. Once you've got your summary of that meeting, then send that back to your supervisor, and your supervisor can then see what it was that went in your head. As supervisors, we say lots of things, lots of useful things to students, and we think we're giving you excellent advice. But sometimes what we say and what we think is going in your head is quite different to what actually appears in your head. So it's quite useful for you to give us some feedback to show us what is in your head. Therefore, we know whether the words that we're using are appropriate. Okay, so help us out a bit as well. As supervisors, help us to know what's gone in, and so we can make sure that we explain things appropriately to your needs. Okay, so you've been doing some research, you've got onto some implementation, and your project's going along swimmingly, and then suddenly at the end of the first semester we now ask you for yet another report. Okay, the interim report is fairly important. What it does is it allows us to see where you're up to with your project, helps us to make sure that you are on target to complete the project and the project is of sufficient standard in order for you to achieve your degree. So for us it's an important monitoring step, and for you actually it's a really good chance to step back and look at what you've done and find out if you were correct in your assumptions at the start of the project, and to give you a chance to review the project, see which direction it's moving in, and adjust it to either move it in a different direction or bring it back into line with what you said you were going to do at the start. So it's a useful report for many different reasons. All really this interim report is a summary of what you've actually done so far. So you're not going to have to make up anything, you're not going to have to write anything special, you're really just summarising what you said you would do. So the original project aims and objectives and the original plan, what you've done so far, and you've got a log. Hopefully by this point you've been recording a logbook of what you've done so far, so you've got that information to put that in. Report on any changes to the project. It's quite important to do that and to show that you understand why you've made those changes. I would expect the weekly Gantt charts to go in this as an appendix. I don't want to see them in the middle of the interim report, but put them all in as an appendix to show regular meetings with your supervisor. And part of this as well will be you describing what you've got left to do. It's very likely that what you've got left to do will be different to your original plan. Okay, sometimes projects carry on and just work out to be exactly what you intended, but quite often, because you've learnt so much more in the first few weeks of this project, the actual purpose of the project does change slightly. You've learnt more about the subject that you're studying, learnt more about the application that you're building, and you've learnt more about your own abilities, so it's very likely that the project will change. This is a good point at which to actually step back and look at that change and understand what it is you're trying to achieve. So mainly the content of this interim report depends on you and what you've done. Okay, you will all have by this point done lots of work, I'm sure, so you'll have plenty to write in there. But the content does depend on what you've done. It's about your actual progress, not pretend progress that you think you should have made. As I said, if you continue to work constantly on the project, as I'm sure you all will, then there's no need to put anything else in other than your actual progress, because it will be good enough. You might have to write it in a particular way, but your progress should be good enough. The interim report is a good reminder for you that you need to make progress throughout the project. It's a little push in the right direction, a reminder that this is actually a project that you have to write about. And whilst it's got its importance in its own ways, we also give it marks because it is a piece of work that you have to do, and we like to reward you for every bit of work that we possibly can. So we give you marks for the interim report. Okay, so your interim report's done, and you can breathe a sigh of relief, and you could possibly put your feet up and have a cup of tea, or you could get on with the project, and I think you probably need to get on with the project. Time will start to move a lot more quickly at this point in the project, so be aware of that. And I think by this time you should be well into the implementation. I'd like to think that you'd have already had a prototype built and practiced with, and know a bit more about what you're going to build for the real thing. So yeah, you'll be onto the implementation, and really within a few weeks you should aim to have finished the implementation and start testing and evaluating your project. Okay, time wise we're only halfway through at this point, but that second semester will go very, very quickly. Use the same weekly meetings with your supervisor. Keep your supervisor busy by asking them for lots of feedback, and often actually as you go through the second half of the project, because you're busy building software and writing stuff, the content of weekly meetings becomes less and less, and I'm willing to be flexible on this. If you decide that you just want to get on with your project work, and rather than sit in a meeting talking about, yeah, I'm still writing code, then that's fine, but you just still need to communicate with your supervisor to make sure they're aware of this. And of course your supervisor may have a different opinion to you, so they may well ask to have a meeting anyway. You must remember to continue to update your progress. Updating progress gets a little bit more of a nuisance when you're actually developing code or building a database or designing a user interface. So it's a bit more of an effort, but you do need to do it, because it actually becomes more and more important that you have the details of what it is that you've been doing, because these will go into the right final report. Okay, so I would say at the latest halfway through the second semester you should have started your final report, and one of the first things you'd do is actually write the chapter headings that go in there. I've given you a sample of chapter headings which we'll see on another slide in a minute, but you will need to actually be more specific about the precise chapters that you're going to write and what is going to go in them. So you would start doing that as early as possible in the second semester. Remember, of course, that you should be keeping notes of your progress, and as I've said already, notes are especially important when things go wrong or when things went wrong, because they detail not only what happened but also how you solved the problems. And things going wrong and how you solve problems is an excellent bit of information for an academic project. Us academics love problems that you've had and how you solved them, and actually you learn an awful lot of stuff from getting things wrong. Just remember that also that when you do your final report, you're reporting on the development of the project and on the project planning, and there's also a section in the learning outcomes on the ethical use of information, so you're going to need to write a little bit about that. So we'll need to keep that in mind as you go through the early stages of the project. The contents of the final report look something like this. As I say, they will be flexible, and especially in the middle chapters it depends how you've actually planned your implementation, but in general they should look something like this. So there'll be a title, and that will be the final title of the project, which may be slightly different from what you proposed originally. There should be an abstract in the project. An abstract is basically a summary of everything that you've done, okay, and I do find a lot of students write the abstract before they've written anything else. You can't do that because it's a summary of what you've written. So, as I've said here, write the abstract last, leave a page for it, put a title in if you want to, but don't write it until you've written everything else. The abstract not only summarises what you've said you will do in the project, but it also summarises your conclusions, and they usually end up being the last thing you write, so you can't summarise them unless you've written them. So, as I've said, it's a, I'm being fussy I suppose with this, but it's a little point that does get on my nerves a little bit, so do me a favour and leave your abstract until the very end of the project. Okay, so you should have a table of contents. This is going to be a relatively large document, so it would be useful to have a table of contents so that your supervisors or the markers can whiz through that and find the really important juicy parts of your project, or refer back to those juicy parts of the project when they want to ask you questions. Chapter 1 then will be the introduction. This is more or less what you put in your project proposal. Okay, it will be slightly more detailed than your project proposal, and some of the aims and some of the aspects of the aims and objectives may be different because you've learned quite a lot about what you thought you were going to do at this point. Okay, so this is the introduction to what you actually did, and as I said, it's based on the project proposal, but it may be slightly more detailed. Chapter 2 should then be the literature review, and the literature review is a rather posh name for saying what you read, what research you did, and what you found out about what you're going to do. So this is the background information about the project and what you're going to achieve. So you're going to look at ways of developing software systems, okay, or ways of developing information systems. So you look at the software development methods. You're going to look at technologies to use in order to do this, and maybe evaluate some different ones to help you decide what it is the best solution to your particular need. And you'll also look at similar systems to the ones that you're producing. Okay, so bear in mind all those things when you're doing your research. You've done your research, you've decided the system that you're going to produce, so now we look at the detailed analysis. So you'll take your initial use case, and in that analysis you break down the use cases, write some specifications, and get a full set of details about what it is that you are going to produce. You'll then design some solutions to that. That will involve user interface design, it will involve database design, and there will be an element of software design which includes algorithms and general architecture of your software. Okay, so all those things have to appear in the design section. And then finally, chapter 5, or thirdly in this section, you'll be writing up your implementation. Now, I don't really like to see implementation chapters that say, well, first I did this, then I did that, then I did that, and then I did this, and then I did that, and then I did this, and then I did that, and then I had a problem, so I did this, and then I did that, and that gets very, very tedious. What we really want to see in the implementation is an overview of what you built and the detail of any great technical feats that you achieved. Okay, what were the things that you really learnt? Where were the problems, and where were those excellent solutions that you found? Okay, or what were the really interesting technical points that you discovered? Okay, so the implementation isn't a diary of what you did when, it's a summary of what you did and some detail of the really interesting points. Now, so there may be some flexibility here in these 3 chapters. Remember, we've talked about iterative developments where you will tend to go through the analysis, design and implementation stages in a series of iterations. If you've broken down your project deliberately into a number of smaller iterations, then one chapter on analysis, design and implementation on each of those analysis, design and implementation isn't really appropriate. It might be better to have a chapter on each iteration rather than a chapter on each stage. Okay, so each iteration would have analysis, design and implementation in it, so you have little subsections within each of those chapters. I can't imagine anyone would have any more than 3 iterations. If you have, then you're a super student and not just a regular student with far more time on your hands than you should perhaps. Okay, so after you've built the system, you're going to have to test it, and I would think about testing from the start when you're building your use cases. Okay, use cases are actually a very good way of testing your software, or certainly testing that you've met the requirements. So think about how you're going to test this system, what it is you're going to find out from that testing. And you're testing the software to make sure it works, but you're also testing against your original objectives. What were you trying to achieve? Does this system that you've built achieve that for you? Okay, the answer could be no to that, but that doesn't really matter too much. But the question, you have to still be able to ask the question of your system. So keep testing in mind all the way through. How are you going to test this system? How are you going to show what it is that you stated you were showing at the start? So you're going to test it, and you're going to present some results of those tests in chapter 6 that I've got it here. Then after you've tested it and you've got some results, you can draw some conclusions. You can actually say, well, I did this and this is what I've discovered from doing that. You may have discovered that your original objectives were a load of old rubbish, okay? Or you may have discovered that your original objectives were fantastic and you've achieved them all perfectly. Either way, you've got plenty of things to write in your conclusions. So you write your conclusions. Your conclusions are really what I found out, how I met my objectives. An evaluation is how well you met your objectives. And I like to think the evaluation can be split into two things. You can evaluate the product that you've built, so how well did your software work, how good was your database, and so on, how good was your coding. And you can also evaluate the actual project itself, so how well did the project go, how well did you plan it, were your objectives realistic, and did the final product actually achieve those objectives. So when you're thinking about the evaluation, think about it as in terms of the product and the project, two separate parts of evaluation. Very important part of the conclusions chapter is the further work. Okay, at the start of the project you'll have built a use case diagram that gave you a large set of possibilities of what could be done with your system. So that actually already gives you some information about further work. Of course, by this point you'll know more detail about how that extra functionality would have been implemented. So don't just say, oh yeah, next time I could, or in the future I could add this functionality. Explain how you would do it and how it would actually change the system. Okay, I want details here, not just a list. So once you've done chapter 7, chapter 7 is very, very important. You need to put all your references in as a reference list at the end, and then finally you'll have a set of appendices that give additional details and additional information. Again, as I've already said, use case diagrams should probably go in there. Entity relationship diagrams should probably go in the appendix. Any diagrams describing the structure of your software should go as an appendix. Okay. It's quite common for students to want to print out all of their code and put that in an appendix. I really wouldn't bother doing that. You need to submit your code as part of your work, and we'll sort out how you're going to achieve that. But I don't really want lists and lists of code in an appendix. I really, nobody's going to actually read it. It really is a waste of time. So we will look at your code and we will look at what you've built, but we don't really want to see every line of your code. What you do with your appendix is perhaps put in 2 or 3 pages that are of a significant portion of the code that you refer to earlier on in the report. Okay, and then any little subroutines or methods that you have used that are interesting, then you put them directly in the report. Okay, but don't just put your code in because you think it's supposed to be there. Okay, so it's arguable really that the conclusions chapter is the most important one. We do put a lot of emphasis on your conclusions because they show that you can evaluate your work and the work of others, and that's an important part of level 6 academic work. So yeah, it is the most important one. It shows the higher skills that you need to demonstrate, but unfortunately you can't actually do a good conclusions chapter unless all the other chapters are actually done well as well. Okay, so it is a very important chapter, but it feeds off everything else that's in the report. Okay, you can't write conclusions unless you've got something to draw conclusions from. So do write a conclusions chapter, and you will know what your conclusions are before you've written the rest of the report, and then make sure that the rest of the report does clearly contribute to those conclusions. Okay, when you're trying to decide out of all the millions of things that you've done for this project what you should write and what you shouldn't write, just always ask yourself the question, does this contribute to the conclusions of my work? If it does, it should be there. If it doesn't, then you could leave it out. Okay, and also you're going to need to include some clear evidence of your working application. Now this really will come around from the testing of your application, but we'll need to decide on a way that you can demonstrate your application as well. Okay, so we'll talk about that nearer the time. Lots of ways that can be done. You could do screencasts, you could and add the files to your submission. You can take just screen captures, images of the screenshots, and you could also provide actually a link to your database on the web and your application on the web, so we can play around with it live and see if we can break it. Okay, we will put full submissions of the details of the submission online, and that'll be there during semester 2 if not before. Okay, I feel like I've talked for quite a while about project and project reports and so on, but what do you need to do next? Well, the tutorial material is the usual thing that you have to do, and the tutorial for this particular topic is really to create your project proposal. Okay, what I'd like you to do though is to get that proposal written as soon as you possibly can during this week and post it up online using the shared folders that I've created on Google Drive. And then what I will need you to do is to review at least one other person's proposal. So basically you're going to act initially as a marker for their proposal. You're going to look at it and you're going to evaluate it and you're going to criticise it. And I'd suggest you be as critical but very politely as possible. Okay. So there's a number of questions. I've put the questions up on the discussion forum that I want you to ask of that proposal that you're reading from one of your fellow students. Somebody else will be, at least one other person will be reading your proposal as well, so any harsh criticism you give to somebody else, I'm sure you'll get back yourself. The reason I want to do this is because actually by looking at somebody else's work you start to see the gaps in your work, not because they've done any better than you. Actually most of you will have a very similar proposal, but things that one person misses out are the things that generally everybody misses out, and you don't really notice it until you're reading somebody else's work. So put a critical eye in and read somebody else's proposal, give them some great feedback that helps them improve what they've done, but bear in mind that their feedback and what you've learned from reading their proposal will also help you improve yours. So once you've completed reading somebody else's proposal and feeding back to them, you then will modify yours and get your final version sorted. It's a great little way of you finding out more about what you've written. And unfortunately I will still have to mark them as well, so I'll look at them afterwards once you've actually between you got some feedback. If you're not sure whose proposal to look at, then I of course will point you in the right direction. I want to make sure everybody reads one and everyone gets feedback, whether that's from one or more other students. So if you have a look at the Dawson book, and if you've got access to it, the Weaver book, I would review the chapters that you've looked at so far, and there's also some various bits and pieces dotted around in these books about managing your supervisors and looking after them and making sure they're doing their job properly. So do that as well. Read as much of those books as you possibly can, because it is all useful, and keep referring back to them throughout the project. Lots of other sources online as well, of course, so keep advising yourself, and of course you've got your supervisors there to help you out throughout all of this. Okay, so whilst this is the end of the lecture series and this is the last topic, I'm still going to be around and I'm still going to be here to help you and advise you on your projects. It does feel like it is a bit of an end here, but it has been a useful, hopefully a useful set of topics, and I of course will appreciate any feedback that you've got for things perhaps that should be in here that you feel are missing, or ways in which it could be presented differently. Always happy for some feedback, and if you thought it was absolutely fantastic, then yeah, tell everybody about it. So this was topic 6, the final topic. So we looked at your project proposals. I gave you some details about the headings that should be in there, and I've given you some information about the interim report and the final report as well. There's quite a lot here, and unfortunately for you, you can look back at this any time that you want to and enjoy the details that are in there. We will also put more information up online as we get nearer to the deadlines for some of these other reports. As usual, any questions online, well, there'll be chat sessions as usual, and there'll be discussion sessions and supervision meetings as well. So there's plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions.